Hey, good foggy Monday morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. I looked outside today and I was like, yep, we can tell we're in coastal North Carolina. Um, the dog was a little scared to go out because the kitties were hidden in the mist, but he still chased some cats away this morning anyway. So we gave him an extra treat for that. But today we're going to talk about a topic that, you know, we may not we may not be as familiar with it unless we know it's hit close to home. And that is churches that are closing their doors. I was actually reading this morning about Fifth Avenue. I believe it's Fifth Avenue Methodist Church downtown. They're still in a legal battle with the United Methodist Conference because they wanted to remove themselves back when it was possible to do that. But from what I understand, and again, this is not very a lot of in-depth study, the United Methodists closed that church before they could get to that process. Not going to go in any commentary there, but it is happening. And I sent Pastor Eddie an article, I believe it was Saturday, about a church in Greenville. And so I went to school in Greenville from I guess 1984 to 1985. I was up there for about a year and a half doing a carpentry program at Pitt Community College, and there's a church it is right in the heart of East Carolina. It's called Emmanuel Baptist Church, and that came across my news feed this weekend, and I was like, let me see if that's where I think it is, and it was like basically a quarter mile from where I used to live. And when you read the article, Pastor and Eddie and I were just talking about this. The church is 100 years old, basically. And again, it is in the heart of downtown Greenville. It is between 5th Street and 14th Street, or 10th Street and 14th Street. It's right down from Dowdy Ficklen Stadium, right across from where I used to live. So there is no shortage of lost people here. Now, granted, even when I was there, that neighborhood was kind of transitioning, flipping over, but it is an established neighborhood. There's a middle school right across the street from the church. There's a Starbucks within walking distance of this church. Can you imagine where I would be if there was a Starbucks within walking distance of this church? So you have multiple opportunities to reach and engage the lost culture there. Um, but yet this article, and it was almost like reading an obituary to me. They were almost being celebrated for closing, I guess, recognizing the church was gone, dead, closing their doors, and they were celebrating all the monies that the church was giving to different organizations, of which some of them were key to us. We saw that they gave money to the CBF, to other what we would call moderate to liberal organizations. So it really was. I mean, it was interesting me from a news perspective because I lived close to there, but it was also disheartening to me because it was like, even though I didn't know this church, but it was like reading the obituary of a friend because it's Emmanuel Baptist Church. I mean, what in the world? So, and of course, I just pulled it up on Google Maps to show Pastor Eddie to familiarize himself with the area. But what were your thoughts when you read that? And we hadn't talked about this. I just saw it
Well,
and sent it to him, and just like, dude, this is crazy.
well, you sent it to me and I read it, and several things popped out at me when I read the
Yeah,
article. But now that we've gotten in here and you've pulled up a map of the area, and I see what all's around this church, it makes it more depressing,
yeah,
because there's no reason why this church should have gotten to the point that it is,
yeah,
except for one thing, and it I don't know anything about this church. I don't know nothing about its leadership or anything else. But just from reading the article and looking at where the church is located, one thing we can say for sure is they lost their focus.
yeah,
There's no doubt about that. That's the only reason that a church in that area, in that populated of an area,
yeah,
with the facilities that they have, they had to have lost their focus, their mission. Uh, it's sad. We read about this every day. Churches are closing, churches are closing, churches are closing. And I think we've said it so much, people have just tuned us out.
Yeah.
They don't
Wah,
know
wah,
what
wah,
to think.
wah.
Wah, wah, wah. There they go again. But this is happening all over the country on a monumental scale because churches have lost their focus. They've lost what they are as a church. They've lost the feel for the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, what it means to be a church, what they're supposed to do as a church, the functions of a church. All that has just gone by the wayside, and it's just going through the motions. But there's several things that jumped out at me. I mean, one of the things that you texted back to me was, well, we don't know when the decline started, and we don't know anything about this church. I haven't pulled any statistics or ACPs on them or anything else, but I can almost guarantee you it started in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, because they are affiliated with CBF, which is Cooperative Baptist Fellowship.
So I was going to say, can you give just a short background of what
Yeah.
CBF is? We throw that around because we know it, but
Right.
that's not.
Back in the 80s, the Southern Baptist Convention had what we called a battle for the Bible. I wasn't even saved at the time. I was in high school when this was going on. I didn't know anything about church or nothing else at that time. But since becoming a Christian and listening to these men that were in that battle during the 80s, Charles Stanley, Adrian Rogers, those guys like that, they saved the Southern Baptist Convention from going the way of the Methodist Church is today. Southern Baptists were actually ahead of decline of the Methodist Church back in the 80s. They were going that direction, and the convention was saved because of that. And what happened is the churches that did not want to say that the Bible was sufficient, that it was authoritative, that it was inerrant, infallible, inspired, they branched off and created what is called the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, CBF. Unfortunately, North Carolina has the largest contingency of CBF churches, and there's some churches that we call duly aligned. They give to the CBF,
They're
and
trying
they
to ride
also
the fence.
give to the Southern Baptist Convention because they want both the best of both worlds, so to speak. They're straddling the fence. But every one of them that are affiliated with CBF are what we would call a liberal church. They're ordaining women as pastors. They're leaning towards liberal causes. They are pro-choice in their understanding of that. Just a lot of wrong theology, wrong teaching, false doctrine, all of that. So when I see a church that, is over 100 years old, and they're saying they're a CBF church, that tells me a lot about that congregation. The fact that they are in the heart of ECU, East Carolina University, which would obviously be a liberal area because I'm telling you, you look on a map, an electoral map, everywhere you see a large contingency of red, there's going to be a college campus in the middle of that. You can look it goes all the way across the United States. So it's in a liberal area. The church became liberal by joining the CBF. And now here they are these many years later, and they're closing up their doors. Again, we always say location, location, location. You could not pick a better location to plant a church than where this church is at. College campus, students all over the place, opportunity for ministry, unbelievable. But what does it say? It says an aging congregation and declining attendance. What does that tell us? Well, one, it's a liberal church. One, they've lost their focus and their mission. But two, I think it tells us that they weren't willing to change. They stayed in the format that they'd always been in, even though everything around them was changing. You got a growing college campus right there in your front door. but you're not reaching out to that. You're not ministering to those people. You're not trying to get those people in the church. You're stuck in your ways. You're stuck in your way of doing things, and therefore, there you go. You end up closing your doors. I mean, wonderful facility, and here we are talking about this article. The other thing that gets me about this article is, like you said, I guess the content of the article was to deal with this IRS mandate on charities, but it does read as if, hey, this was a good thing. This was a positive thing for this church to close its doors and to sell its property and all of its assets and turn around and divvy those up to all these different organizations. That is what I get out of the article. I think that's what you got out of the article as well. They're throwing a lot of cash around to a lot of different people, and therefore somehow that makes it okay that this church is closed. There's nothing on here derogatory about the church closing.
No.
There's nothing on here, hey, we're upset about this. You know, they're almost glorifying the fact that yet another church is closed, and what did they do with their money? Almost like, okay, church, if you're close to this, why don't you follow their example? You know, it's like, you know, from somebody that's not in a convention standpoint, I'm not involved as far as leadership in the convention, but this would have upset me tremendously as a North Carolina Baptist state convention, that something couldn't have been worked out where somebody could have taken over that property and used it as a way of ministering to ECU and getting to those college students, putting somebody in there that's going to not only have right theology and doctrine, but somebody that's going to have a heart for reaching young people on a college campus. Because, I mean, my goodness, I can't think of a better place to have put something in place. Like you said, there's a Starbucks. Right in the heart of this campus and a huge neighborhood all around there. There's no shortage of lostness, as you said, and there's no shortage of people. And this should have been a replant. It should have been somebody taking over this property. But evidently, those that were involved with this church didn't want that.
Well, and that's that was the, I guess you could say, it's never good when a church closes, but we know, like with our state convention, there's programs and plans for churches that find themselves, if you will, dying out for whatever reason. They can approach the convention and say, hey, we would like to let our church be used, like you say, for a church plant. Somebody else come in here and use these facilities, use this property. And again, we're just inferring from an article, but it looks like they sold the property. Mm-hmm. And again, we don't know what their network, their association is like up there. Don't know who they were with. But still, it's almost like this may be a little extreme, but it's almost like the kingdom had a representation there in that community, and then they just gave it away. And of course, the world, the secular world, celebrates it because they obviously got. I mean, it is prime property. They obviously got a lot of money for that, so they're giving it away to their causes. And like Pastor Eddie said, and I did look. I tried to find it just then, but found their Facebook page, and it showed, up until that point, it looked like they were really active on their Facebook page, but then it showed their last service. And they were celebrating the fact that it was so packed for the last service. And I'm like, this is just so weird for me. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm, in an alternate universe here. But yeah, Twilight Zone. And I'm thinking, but don't you guys, I don't know anything about the other churches in the area. But shouldn't there be some grief somewhere? I don't know. So anyway, to me, it was just a warning. I think all churches should be cognizant of the fact, and church members should be cognizant of the fact that this is happening. And if you do not, hold the line, maintain the, whatever, it can happen to you. Because I guarantee you, this church had a bank account. At one time, they had no telling how many members. Like you say, if they participated in the ACP, it'd be interesting to see that. But what happened?
Yeah. Well,
Which reminds me of that book, Autopsy of a Dying Church.
yes, it does. Absolutely. But, this is the byproduct of a couple of things. One, churches losing their focus. Two, getting away from a high view of Scripture, and teaching truth from the pulpit, and growing up, raising up new leaders, being willing to change. We talk a lot about the world needs to change. The world's not going to change till the church changes. I mean, that's just the way it is. We're to be salt and light, and we can't be salt and light if we're doing what some of these churches are doing. But it's God's church. That's the part that breaks my heart. This is God's church. The people that planted that church planted it there for a reason. They worked that soil. They cultivated that area. The church obviously had a heyday, as we like to say, because of the facilities they've got. They had to have had a heyday. Probably peaked somewhere early 80s. And then there was that riff that probably took place. And from there on, it was probably steady decline from there. But this is avoidable. That's the thing I want everybody to understand. It doesn't have to be that way. There was a couple that came up to me after the service yesterday, young couple, very young couple, involved in Christian ministry, Christian education. They're in between churches because the last two churches, well, the main church that they were at most of their life, started going in this direction. The sermons had become, one verse, and a couple of jokes and, some stories, and then that was it. There was no meat there whatsoever. So they started looking around, and they'd been to a couple of other churches, and they were seeing the same thing at those churches. And they've been coming to us for a decent amount of time now. They've been through our new membership class. They just haven't joined. And when they came down front yesterday to talk to me, I said, well, what's keeping you from joining? Tell me that. Answer that question for me, because they had a question for me and I answered it.
There you go.
And I said, hey, I got a question for you. What's keeping you from joining this church? And they said, basically what they said was, we want to make sure this time that we're making the right decision, and everything we're seeing, hearing, we're loving, but we're just taking our time. We want to make sure that where we land the next time, that's it. And which I agree. I mean, I think that's a great thing. But that's where people are today. They're skeptical of what the church is doing and what the church is producing and what the church is putting out there, because they've seen the other side of things.
Well, even like you said last night, with some of the YWAM team came up to you, and they tell them what you said, that rightfully so, they expected to find when they got here.
Yeah, they expected to not see, it's a 100-year-old church. They thought it'd be a typical First Baptist church. That was their language.
Yeah.
I know what that means.
Yes, I do too.
A lot of our people don't, but I know what that means. But it means just like this. It means, hey, it's an older congregation. It's an older church. They're stuck in their ways. They're still doing things like they did back in the 80s and 90s, unwilling to change, not missional at all. And they were blown away to see what we were doing missionally, because that's outreach. That's the kingdom. That's what churches are supposed to be doing. And obviously we're not anywhere close to where I want to be. But we are doing some things, and they saw those things, and they saw that being played out in front of them while they were here for their short time. So yes, I mean that's what we see. That's what's going on all around us. It's going on here in Wilmington. It's going on in North Carolina. It's going on around the country, and it's avoidable. That's the
Yeah.
thing. Churches have got to get over themselves and the pride that they're walking around with, and realize that, listen, any business out there, and I'm not trying to equate the church with a business, but I'm trying to use common sense. When all you got to do is pull your ACP, your statistics over the years, and if it's doing this, a gradual decline, there's a problem, and it should have been addressed when it started. But most churches don't look at those things. They rely on the pastor to somehow come in and tell them, and then they're saying, "Well, you're putting down the church. You're talking negative about the church." No, we're just trying to be realistic and say, listen, there's a problem here. If you got a business and your sales are constantly diving, eventually you're going to say, you know what, I'm losing more money than I'm making. Things are not going right. I've either got to change my business model or do something else. It drives me insane. People say, well, you're just change. I hate change. All right. I am, and Stuart can attest, I'm the pickiest guy you'll ever find anywhere when it comes to food.
Yep.
There's nobody like me. I'm in a class by myself, and I understand that. I can't stand it when a restaurant changes its menu. I already know what I want when I walk in there. You know, if you've already got a good product, why change it?
How dare
right?
they?
But see, that doesn't work, because people want variety. They want to come in there and not see the same thing every time. Why do businesses every now and then change the way their layout is in their business? You know, you go into a perfectly good Chick-fil-A and all of a sudden they've done a remodel, because when they do that, it looks new again. It's more appealing. They've probably added a few things or something to their layout to make it a little bit better. They're constantly evaluating what they're doing and what they're trying to put out there. So you got things that are new and they're out there for a little while, and then they go away, and then they come back. I think of McDonald's, you know,
Yep.
like
I
the
was just thinking of
McRibs.
that. Yep.
They'll take those away for a little while, and everybody says, man, I wish they would bring those back, and they bring them back, and everybody's all excited. McDonald's is full. Listen, the church is not a business, but you've got to move if you're going to grow. You can't stay and say, well, this is the way it is, and if they want to come, they'll come. No, they won't. They're not going to do it. And churches that are stuck in the mud and sticking to what they've always done, they're going to get what they've always gotten. And that decline is just going to continue downward. And then you throw in bad theology and everything else. Now you really got a problem. But, you know, like I said, it's avoidable. Churches can be replanted. Churches can be revived. But the congregation that has ownership of that facility, that building, has to get over themselves and get over their pride and say, you know what, we need help. We don't know what to do. And it's not changing the guy in the pulpit that's going to make the difference. They can help, but it's not going to make all the difference. The church itself, which is the members, not the building, they've got to realize that we've got a problem, and we can't continue to do things the way we've always done them. Or we're going to get the same results we've always gotten. So it takes bringing somebody in that's going to lead. It takes following that leadership. It takes, hey, every person on deck, let's turn this thing around. Let's be the church we want to be, that the people who planted this church meant for it to do and be, and realize that, you know, we've got a mandate of Scripture that says the gates of hell are not going to prevail against God's church. Now, we know that's talking about the church universal. It's not talking about a particular church in a building or whatever somewhere. Ultimately, God's church wins. Ultimately, God wins.
Yep.
We know that. But it appears at times that Satan's winning these little battles. He's going to lose the war, but he's winning these little battles, and it doesn't have to be that way. All we got to do is reach out and say, hey, we need help. And there's plenty of people out there that can come in and help. The problem is we say we need help, but we want to do it our way. And that's the problem. Churches that have revitalized and have come back from the brink of death, which has happened a lot here lately, are churches that said, listen, we don't know what we're doing. We need help. We're willing to do whatever it takes. And that's the mentality. It's got to be whatever it takes.
Yeah.
We're willing to do that. If it means we've got to change some music, we're going to change music. If it means we've got to get a different pastor, we're going to get a different pastor. If it means that we got to change our bylaws or our structures and do things we've never done before, then that's on the table. Everything's on the table. We don't change the message, but we've got to change the method in what we're doing. And churches that don't change the method are going to die. It's just the reality of things. But the moral of this story is it doesn't have to get to this point. It doesn't have to be this way. And even if the church gives up, that property is valuable.
Yes.
And if you can't make it go, then turn it over to somebody else who can make it go. I've had the pleasure of planning other churches in my ministry as the pastor of a church, planning other churches. And in every one of those cases, it was a takeover. You know, the church was fixing to fold. They had got down to just about nothing. They had property. They had some assets. And we reached out to them and said, hey, don't sell your property. Don't do this. Let's see if we can get another church started here. And we were able to do that on three separate occasions, in the United States. So it's doable. It is a pain. It is a lot of work. It is overburdening on that church that's doing that. But that's why you've got a convention. That's why you got an association. That's why you got other churches out there that are willing to come in there and do that to try to reach people with the gospel. And, you know, you think about all these, what I call storefront churches, these churches that are just, you know, they're in a storefront because they don't have any property. They can't go out and build a brand new building on expensive property and everything else. So they find themselves renting a small area to try to have a church in. And then you read something like this, where you got a great facility and a great location, and they're selling their property and giving it all away.
And that property's gone.
You'll
never be able to afford it now.
No, not a bit. And it's never going to be used for the kingdom. And that's the thing. You know, I my heart breaks for those people that started that church over 100 years ago, and those that, like I said, tilled that soil and worked that community and grew that church. And that's probably not the original building. I'm sure it's not. And the growth of that place and all the things that went in, the hard work, the dedication, the blood, sweat, and tears. And now it's gone. And, that's a tragedy. It's a very tragic moment, but, yeah, a lot of things we could say about that, and probably a lot of them aren't good. But the main thing is it doesn't have to be that way. If you're finding yourself and you're in a situation like that, then reach out to the convention, reach out to the local association, reach out to other churches in the area, and get some help and say, hey, you know, we don't know what to do. Ministry, as I said last night, is difficult, and it is difficult. But that's why you've got brothers and sisters. That's why you got other pastors. That's why you got associations and state conventions to come alongside you and try to help. And I know our state convention will help in any way possible.
Yep.
I know Todd Unzicker's heart for churches, and I know his heart for college campuses and things like that. And I'm sure if he's read this story or knew about it, and I'm sure he does, I haven't talked to him about it, but I'm sure it made him sick to see that property go by the wayside, because there's nowhere around that campus that we could go and purchase a piece of property and put a ministry there and be able to afford to get it off the ground. It's just no way. So huge loss there. For the kingdom, but it's happening everywhere, and we as the church need to wake up and realize, you know, but for the grace of God, there go we, and we got to make sure that we guard every single day against that happening with us or with others. We've got to stay vigilant and do what we're supposed to do how we're supposed to do it, and take it seriously. Again, church is serious. We should have fun. We do. We should. It should be a good experience, and it should be that way. But it's life and death, folks. I mean, it's literally life and death. This church is in this community as a lighthouse to this community that is surrounded by darkness, and we are the light in this area. So we've got to let that light shine. If we don't let it shine, then it'll be just like this church. And that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, 109 years. And in this article, of which the chairman of deacons, she said that the sad thing is there's no mention of Jesus Christ in this whole article. 109 years, so it's pretty close to Wrightsboro's age. But again, whenever you see something like that, whenever you hear something like this, you need to think, why did that happen? Not a shortage of lost people there. 1984, when I was there, not a shortage of lost people there. 2025, 24, when it closed, there was not a shortage of lost people there. So that tells you the problem lay with the church.
Yeah.
What that problem was, we can't say, but we've got to be careful. Every decision we make leads us somewhere, and we got to really be careful that it's leading us in God's plan and not away from that. So
let me say this, and then I'll be done. But CBF churches, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship churches, are closing at a very high rate. And you would think the opposite.
yeah,
You would think a liberal church would be flourishing in the culture in which we live, but it just tells us the Bible's true. You get away from the focus and the mission of what God's church is supposed to be, God's not going to bless that church. And if you take the anointing of God off of a church, you take the blessing of God off a church, it doesn't matter who you have, what you have, how much money you have, obviously,
I guarantee you there was money in that church.
Yes. God's not going to bless it because it's outside the scope of what he says a church is supposed to be. And that's what we need to understand about this. CBF churches are closing left and right because they are liberal churches, and they've gotten away from their mission, and they've gotten away from the scriptures, and they've lost the blessing of God on there. Now, you can have whatever you want to in a church, but if you don't have the blessing of God upon that place, you're not going anywhere. You're not doing anything. You've got to have that blessing. You got to have that anointing. You got to have God in that church, or it's just man driven. Man can do church really well.
Yep.
And it can look really good, but without that supernatural power that we see in the book of Acts, that we see throughout the New Testament in a church that is growing and flourishing and doing what it's supposed to do, unless you have that, you don't have anything. And that's the issue. And so that mindset is going by the wayside, and those churches are closing at a high rate of speed, which is depressing because they're doing things like this with their property. But churches that are doing what they're supposed to do, preaching what they're supposed to preach, holding the line, doing missions, getting involved in their communities, God is blessing. And you say, well, they may only be 70 people. Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
God's not concerned about the size. He's concerned about the heart. And if that church is doing what it's supposed to do, they may be 70, but you don't realize that they're sponsoring missions over here and missions over here, and they're sending people out, and they may have already populated into 2 or 3 other churches, which is a good thing. You don't have to build, 5,000 people on Sunday morning. You may have multiple campuses with, 100 people, and able to touch so much more and cover so much more area. So we've got to realize what's going on. We can't just look at the size of a church. We can't look at the property of a church. We got to look at what's going on in that church, and what that church is doing. And if God's blessing, then God's blessing. If he's not, he's not. And So we need to pray about ourselves. We need to pray for our church, that we don't fall into these same traps that these churches are falling into.
Yep, and this is not meant to discourage, but it's meant to
No.
warn. It's meant to encourage every member really to hold that line, to live the scriptures, to know what you believe, why you believe it. You know, doctrine. Doctrine used to be a dirty word, but it's a good word. You need to know why you believe what you believe in the truths of Scripture. So, there you go. Wherever you are, be all there. And uh, when if you're a member of this church, get plugged in. If you're listening to us, you're a member of another church. Be plugged in. If that church is not a biblical church, find somewhere else.
Yeah.
There comes a point in a church where if you're trying to turn it back to where it needs to be, where God wants it to be, there's a point where you may not have any influence left and you need to move on. So, but that's a decision between you and God. So thank y'all for joining us, and we'll see you next Monday.